Thank you for joining us for Ask a Therapist, the Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina series, in which we speak with mental health professionals about issues many people face every day. Today, we are joined by Anitra Doughty-Wages, a licensed social worker and certified health coach with Blue Cross. We are talking about trauma. She has worked with many members who have experienced trauma from car accidents, war zones, and ones who have experienced generational trauma as well. She says her job is to educate people about trauma and equip them with coping skills so they can manage their traumatic symptoms to live a healthy life. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
Okay, so what is trauma?
Trauma, particularly in a behavioral health context, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. So unfortunately, trauma can lead to emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical symptoms that can persist long after the traumatic event has actually happened.
So does it have to be an event, like a physical event that someone encounters?
No, it does not have to be. So you can experience something called vicarious trauma, which is when you either hear about an event or experience an event, and it is just as impactful as you actually going through that trauma yourself.
Oh, wow. Can anybody experience trauma, or are there like some people who are maybe more susceptible to trauma?
Anybody can experience trauma, regardless of age, gender, identity, or cultural background. And each person that experiences trauma goes through it in a different way. So it's important for us to have information and resources available to individuals who experience trauma. It's very important.
So you said you can all experience it differently. So it's possible that someone might find something traumatic and someone else might not find it traumatic. We all experience that differently.
That is true. So you and I could possibly go through the same traumatic event and we process it differently. And that's based upon a lot of things: age, cultural background, whether you've had previous trauma in the past, and any kind of stressors that you're going through will definitely impact how that trauma is processed and experienced.
I think a lot of people, when we think about trauma, we think about those like kind of big keystone events. Does it have to be a dramatic event to be traumatic?
No. So I always say an event does not have to be. What we particularly say is traditionally looked at as dramatic. So what I mean by that is we can experience trauma through disasters, acts of terrorism, and that to some people may not be as dramatic, but it is severe trauma that is being experienced when those events happen.
What is collective trauma?
So collective trauma is when a group of people with similarities, whether it's a cultural background, community background, experience disturbing or distressing events as a collective unit. So again, that could be due to historical events, or it could be, again, based upon more collective traumas such as disasters or acts of terrorism.
And so how does trauma, taking that next step further, how does this trauma impact your mental health?
Trauma definitely affects our mental health on so many levels. Definitely on an emotional level, it can affect you physically and psychologically. So there are a lot of signs and symptoms that we see to kind of cue us in to know that individuals are experiencing trauma. And some of the things that we could see is an individual that becomes anxious. They develop PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, any forms of depression, anxiety. So the trauma trickle down into so many different aspects of your life to where we have to have good support systems in place and things such as therapy or counseling to help individuals to heal.
And that can show up differently for everybody.
Yes, different for everybody based upon, again, the cultural backgrounds, just how you handle stress, whether or not you have any coping skills in place, all of that will affect trauma and the extent of an individual's trauma.
So how can someone know they've experienced trauma or are having a traumatic response? Like, what are some of the signs and symptoms of trauma?
The signs and symptoms of trauma vary by each individual. First of all, I want to make sure that I let everybody know that simple, maybe at the surface, symptoms could be, again, the depression, anxiety. We could experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There are so many other emotional aspects that individuals may try to mask. So to me, it's important to acknowledge these symptoms to be able to move forward to get the help that you need.
So, like, now that we know what the symptoms are, how can people cope with trauma?
There are several ways that people can actually cope with trauma. So first and foremost, you definitely will need an excellent support system. So that can consist of family, friends, and I always go a step further saying that with your loved ones, pay attention to what they're going through and validate, first of all, validate their trauma. Once you see that the trauma is present, it would not help to try to convince them into getting counseling or therapy. That's very important. If you see as a loved one that someone that you love is struggling in that way, you also want to work on developing coping mechanisms. Mindful therapy helps with that. That could be relaxation. It could be taking a walk in nature, things just as simple as that. But if we're at a point to where the trauma is affecting everyday life, definitely a suggestion will be to get some professionals involved that can help your family to cope better and to heal.
So how can people support their loved ones who have maybe experienced a traumatic event?
It's a very good question. So first of all, family, they need to be supportive. Family and friends, supportive and validate their feelings, because a lot of times people go through trauma and either people don't believe their trauma or maybe they mask it to where it's not really seen. So if they talk about it, you definitely want to practice open listening and you want to validate their feelings, first of all. Again, I would seek professional help if they are emotionally disturbed. That's very important. I can't stress that enough. Counseling, therapy, it makes a difference. And if we see symptoms, maybe our loved one does not see those symptoms, and we can make them aware of the fact that we love them and we do want to see them heal and be the best version of themselves. So definitely find them support groups. If you aren't knowledgeable on how to give information with an individual that's experienced trauma, it could even be spiritual-based community groups or through their job, things of that nature. But we want to be as supportive as we can, but we have to know our limits as well. So if further action is needed by a professional, we can encourage them. We can't force them, but encourage them to seek help.
Does trauma go away?
Trauma initially does not go away. How we deal with trauma makes a difference, how we cope. So, for instance, again, you and I may experience the same traumatic episode, but due to our different backgrounds, ethnicity, our community, our support systems, all of that will determine how we deal with our trauma. So it's important to know that everyone experiences trauma differently, and how we help them depends on what their needs are. So start out definitely with the support systems that they have in place and those coping mechanisms, and move forward to professional help as needed.
Thank you, Anitra, for joining us. This conversation about mental health and getting help is incredibly important. We hope this discussion can help you or someone you know. Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina members can call the number on the back of your insurance card for mental health resources. We hope you'll join us again for the next Ask a Therapist podcast.